Hollywood shows the Wild West with endless gunfights and revolvers that never run dry. The reality was harder and far more constrained. Ammunition was expensive, resupply was uncertain. Moisture ruined percussion caps, black powder fouled barrels after a handful of shots, brass casings stretched and split, lead bullets deformed, or wooden chamber in worn-out guns. Across hundreds of miles of open country, there was no gunsmith, no replacement parts, and no second shipment coming. So frontiersmen developed workarounds, not innovations born from genius, but practical fixes born from necessity. They adapted bullets, stretched powder, salvaged lead, and reloaded until the brass physically gave out. Some hacks were clever, others were desperate. A few were dangerous enough to destroy the guns they were meant to save. This is a countdown of 15 ammunition hacks that actually worked on the American frontier, ranked by how much risk, ingenuity, or systemic thinking they required. We're starting with simple adaptations and ending with the one practice that reframes everything above it, a closed-loop system that turns scarcity itself into strategy. Number 15. Paper patch bullets. Accuracy mattered more than most people realized. A hunter missing his shot didn't just lose meat, he lost the powder, the lead, and the time it took to stalk close enough for another chance. That's why some frontiersmen turned to paper patch bullets, wrapping their lead projectiles in thin paper before loading them into rifled barrels. The principle was simple. A plain lead bullet, when fired through a rifled bore, had to grip the lands and grooves to spin. That contact created friction, and friction meant fouling. The more you fired, the worse it got. Eventually, accuracy collapsed and loading became nearly impossible. Wrapping the bullet in paper, usually onion skin or cigarette paper, created a barrier between the soft lead and the steel rifling. The paper gripped the grooves, the bullet spun true, and fouling buildup slowed. Shooters could fire more rounds before accuracy degraded, and when it came time to clean, the barrel came out easier. Target shooters and long-range marksmen adopted the practice first, especially those using heavy single-shot rifles like the Sharps. Competitive matches in the 1870s and 1880s saw paper-patched bullets hitting steel plates at distances where unpatched lead scattered wide. Buffalo hunters picked up the technique because consistent accuracy meant fewer wasted shots on expensive, dangerous hunts. The trade-off was time. Each bullet had to be wrapped by hand, the paper cut to size and dampened slightly so it would cling without tearing. In cold weather, wet paper froze. In heat, it dried too fast and came loose. And if the patch wasn't seated evenly, the bullet flew crooked anyway. Paper patching wasn't universal, but for men who needed repeatable precision over long distances, it was one of the few ways to stretch accuracy without constant cleaning. It didn't solve scarcity. It just made each shot count a little more. But wrapping bullets was a luxury of preparation. The next hack was born from needing more stopping power when precision didn't matter at all. Number 14. Buck and ball loads. When a single bullet wasn't enough, frontier shooters loaded both. Buck and ball was a combination load, one large round ball paired with several smaller buckshot pellets, all stuffed into a single charge. It turned a musket or shotgun into a weapon that could wound at close range, even if the main projectile missed. The practice dated back to military conflicts, where smoothbore muskets struggled with accuracy beyond 50 yards. Soldiers hedged their bets by loading a .65 caliber ball on top of 3 or 4 buckshot pellets, each round .30 caliber. When fired, the ball flew relatively straight while the buckshot spread, increasing the chance of hitting something in chaotic close quarters fighting. Civilians on the frontier adopted the same logic. Settlers defending cabins or travelers ambushed on the trail didn't have time for careful aim. A buck and ball load gave them multiple projectiles in one shot, improving their odds when speed and fear made precision impossible. Hunters used it on dangerous game at close range, knowing a charging bear or wild hog wouldn't go down from a single hole. Loading it was straightforward but required care. Powder went in first, then a wad, then the ball, then the buckshot, then another wad to hold everything in place. The challenge was keeping the shot from shifting during carry or deforming under the shock of ignition. If the pellets bunched or the ball tilted, the load could keyhole or damage the barrel. Buck and ball didn't extend range or improve accuracy. It increased the likelihood of inflicting damage when nothing else would. For men facing threats too close and too fast for a second shot, that was enough. But combining projectiles in one load was still relatively conventional. The next hack required stripping ammunition down to its components and rebuilding it by hand. Number 13. Rolled paper cartridges. Before metallic cartridges became standard, black powder firearms relied on loose components, powder, ball, and wadding, all loaded separately. Rolling paper cartridges solved the problem of speed without requiring factory-made ammunition. A shooter could prepare dozens in advance, each one holding a measured powder charge and bullet in a single package. The process was meticulous. A sheet of paper, usually from old newspapers, letters, or any scrap available, was cut to size and rolled around a wooden dowel or forming stick. One end was twisted shut, powder poured in, then the bullet seated on top, and the other end folded or tied closed. The result was a self-contained round that could be bitten open, the powder poured down the barrel, and the ball rammed home with the paper serving as wadding. Soldiers used rolled cartridges extensively during the Civil War and earlier conflicts. By the 1870s, frontiersmen still carried them when metallic cartridges were unavailable or too expensive. A man with a percussion revolver or single-shot rifle could prepare a supply before leaving camp, knowing each cartridge delivered consistent charges without the risk of spilling loose powder on the trail. The advantage was preparation and speed. Pre-rolled cartridges eliminated guesswork and reduced loading time under pressure. The paper also kept powder dry in moderate conditions, though heavy rain or river crossings rendered them useless. The downside was durability. Paper tore, powder leaked, and bullets shifted. Over time, cartridges became unreliable. They also required decent paper stock, which wasn't always available in remote areas. Some men wrapped theirs in oiled cloth for extra protection, but that added weight and reduced the number they could carry. Rolled paper cartridges were a bridge between loose powder and modern ammunition. They didn't solve scarcity, but they made limited supplies more manageable. Still, paper eventually gave way to something more robust, cartridges designed to burn entirely upon firing. Number 12. Combustible cartridges. Combustible cartridges took the idea of paper cartridges one step further. Instead of tearing them open, you loaded the entire package into the gun and let it burn during ignition. The casing was made from nitrated paper or linen, materials chemically treated to ignite cleanly and leave minimal residue. The appeal was speed and simplicity. A shooter could load a combustible cartridge in one motion, drop it into the chamber, ram it home, cap the nipple, and fire. No tearing, no loose powder, no fumbling with separate components. For cavalrymen or anyone needing rapid reloads on horseback, combustible cartridges were a significant improvement over loose powder. They saw military use in the years leading up to and during the Civil War, particularly with revolvers like the Colt Model 1860 Army, which was designed to accept them. The U.S. military issued combustible cartridges to cavalry units, and after the war, surplus stock spread across the frontier. But combustible cartridges had serious drawbacks. The nitrated paper was fragile and moisture sensitive. A damp cartridge wouldn't ignite properly, leaving smoldering residue inside the chamber and risking a hang fire or misfire. Storage was difficult. They had to be kept dry and handled carefully to avoid tearing. And unlike brass casings, they were single-use with no possibility of reloading. Hunters and settlers used them when available, but most couldn't justify the cost or fragility. They worked well in controlled conditions, but failed quickly in the dust, rain, and rough handling common on the plains. By the late 1870s, metallic cartridges had largely replaced them, though combustible rounds lingered in the hands of those who'd stockpiled them or couldn't afford better. They were a step forward, but still dependent on factory production and vulnerable to the frontier's harshest conditions. The next hack moved away from cartridge design entirely and focused on keeping bullets moving smoothly through fouled barrels. One quick thing, if you've seen a different version of this done in books, museums, or family stories, drop it in the comments. Frontier ammo practices varied a lot, and the details matter. Number 11. Grease cookies and lubricated wads. Black powder was filthy. Every shot left a coating of carbon and burned residue inside the barrel, and after a few rounds, that buildup made loading difficult and accuracy unreliable. The solution wasn't better powder, it was lubrication applied directly between shots. Grease cookies were small discs of tallow, beeswax, or animal fat pressed into shape and placed over the powder charge before seating the bullet. When fired, the grease melted and coated the barrel, softening fouling and making the next load easier to ram home. Some shooters used pre-cut wads soaked in lubricant, while others simply smeared grease onto cloth patches wrapped around bullets. The practice was common among target shooters and buffalo hunters, who fired dozens of rounds in a session and couldn't afford to stop every few shots to clean their rifles. A properly lubricated wad extended the number of shots a rifleman could fire before fouling became unmanageable, sometimes doubling or tripling effective shooting time. Preparation varied. Some men made batches of grease cookies in advance, mixing tallow with beeswax for consistency and storing them in tins. Others carried blocks of plain grease and cut pieces as needed. The mixture had to be soft enough to melt under firing heat, but firm enough not to leak during carry. The downside was mess. Grease attracted dust, which meant fouling still accumulated, just more slowly. In extreme cold, the grease hardened and lost effectiveness. In heat, it liquefied and soaked into powder charges, sometimes causing misfires. And any grease-soaked wad left residue that eventually had to be cleaned anyway. Still, for men who needed sustained fire without constant maintenance, grease cookies were one of the few practical answers. They didn't eliminate fouling, they just bought time. But lubrication only delayed the problem. The next hack addressed scarcity directly by reclaiming the lead itself. Number 10. Salvaged, lead, recasting. Lead was expensive and heavy, which made it one of the most carefully managed resources on the frontier. When bullets were fired, deformed, or lost, the lead wasn't gone, it was just misshapen. Frontiersmen salvaged it, melted it down, and recast it into new projectiles. Recasting required simple tools, a small ladle or melting pot, a heat source, and a bullet mold. Spent bullets were collected from target areas, dug out of trees, or recovered from game animals. Damaged rounds, misfires, and even old musket balls were thrown into the pot. Once melted, the lead was poured into molds and allowed to cool, producing fresh bullets ready for use. Soldiers, hunters, and settlers all practiced recasting. Military camps often had designated spaces for melting and molding lead, and civilian hunters carried portable molds in their kits. A man with a good supply of scrap lead could sustain himself for weeks without needing to buy more. The quality of recast bullets varied. Pure lead melted cleanly and filled molds evenly, but salvaged lead often contained impurities, dirt, oxidation, and trace metals that weakened the final product. Bullets cast from scrap sometimes had voids or uneven weight distribution, which hurt accuracy. Some shooters added small amounts of tin to harden the lead, improving performance in rifled barrels. Recasting also required fuel and time. Melting lead over a campfire took patience, and pouring molds in windy or wet conditions led to defects. But for men hundreds of miles from supply lines, recasting turned waste into ammunition. It didn't solve shortages, but it stretched what was already on hand. Still, recasting worked best with loose lead. The next hack addressed what to do when factory ammunition wasn't designed for the gun you had. Number 9. Improvised shotgun slugs. Shotguns on the frontier weren't just for birds. They were defensive weapons, hunting tools, and sometimes the only firearm a settler owned. But buckshot spread too wide for precise shots beyond 30 yards, and factory slugs were expensive or unavailable. So shooters improvised their own. The simplest method was to load a single large ball, often a musket ball or a piece of scrap lead roughly shaped, into a shotgun shell or directly down the barrel of a muzzle loader. The ball had to be large enough to grip the bore without rattling, but small enough to avoid jamming. Wadding was packed tightly around it to hold it in place and create a gas seal. Some men used multiple smaller balls stacked together, while others poured molten lead into shells to create crude slugs on the spot. The result wasn't elegant, but it turned a scattergun into a short-range rifle capable of dropping deer, hogs, or dangerous predators with a single heavy projectile. Accuracy was inconsistent. Improvised slugs wobbled in flight, and without rifling to stabilize them, they tumbled unpredictably. Effective range was limited to 50 or 60 yards at most, and even then, hitting a specific target required luck as much as skill. The real danger was overpressure. Loading too much powder or seating a slug too tightly could burst a barrel, especially in older or cheaper shotguns. Accounts from frontier doctors mention injuries from improvised loads that blew guns apart in shooters' hands. But when buckshot couldn't reach and rifles weren't available, improvised slugs gave shotgun owners a way to extend their effective range. It was crude, risky, and unreliable, but better than no option at all. The next hack went the opposite direction, pushing ammunition beyond its factory specifications for specific tactical advantages. Number 8. Express loads. Most ammunition was designed for balance, enough powder to deliver energy without excessive recoil or barrel wear. Express loads ignored that balance. They were deliberately overcharged cartridges built to maximize velocity and hitting power, regardless of the cost to the shooter or the gun. The term express came from British hunting, where powerful loads were developed for dangerous game in Africa and India. American hunters adopted the idea for frontier use, hand-loading cartridges with extra powder to increase the speed and impact of heavy bullets. A standard .45-70 load might push a 405-grain bullet at 1,300 feet per second. An express load could reach 1,500 or more. The advantage was stopping power. Against large animals like grizzly bears, elk, or buffalo, an express load delivered devastating energy at close to medium range. It also extended the effective reach of some rifles, flattening trajectory and improving performance at distances where standard loads began to drop. The cost was immediate and brutal. Recoil increased sharply, making express loads punishing to fire repeatedly. Barrels wore faster under higher pressures, and cheaper or older guns risked catastrophic failure. Brass casings stretched more aggressively, limiting the number of times they could be reloaded. And powder consumption meant shooters burned through supplies faster. Express loads weren't everyday ammunition. They were specialized tools used when nothing else would guarantee a clean kill or a reliable stop. Guides, professional hunters, and men working in genuinely dangerous conditions carried them, knowing the trade-off was worth it when a single shot had to count. But pushing loads to the limit required quality brass and tight tolerances. The next hack addressed what happened when neither was available. Honest question: which of these would you actually trust your life to so far? Not which sounds clever, but which one you'd be willing to fire if failure meant you didn't get a second chance. Number 7. Picket bullets. Accuracy at extreme range required more than good shooting. It required bullets designed to stay stable in flight. Picket bullets were one answer: elongated, pointed projectiles that seeded deep into the rifling, gripping the lands and grooves more aggressively than standard round balls or short conicals. The design was straightforward. A picket bullet was long and narrow, often 2 to 3 times the length of its diameter, with a sharp nose and a flat or slightly concave base. When loaded, it extended far into the barrel, engaging the rifling over a greater surface area. That contact gave it superior spin stabilization, which translated into tighter groups at long distances. Competitive marksmen and long-range hunters favored picket bullets for matches and hunts where precision mattered more than speed. At distances beyond 500 yards, a well-made picket could outperform standard bullets by a wide margin, holding tighter spirals and resisting wind drift more effectively. But picket bullets came with serious drawbacks. They were difficult to load, requiring careful alignment and significant force to ram home without damaging the rifling or deforming the bullet. Loading them in the field was slow and awkward, making them impractical for rapid fire or self-defense. They also required perfectly clean barrels. Any fouling made seating nearly impossible. Manufacturing them by hand was tedious. Molds had to be precisely machined, and pouring long, thin bullets without voids or imbalance required skill. Factory-made pickets were expensive and rarely available outside major supply hubs. For men who needed absolute accuracy, target shooters, military sharpshooters, or hunters stalking game at extreme distances, picket bullets were worth the effort. Everyone else stuck to simpler designs. The next hack moved away from bullet design entirely and focused on managing the powder itself when supplies ran dangerously low. Number 6. Powder charge thinning. When powder ran short, the instinct was to ration shots. But some shooters took a different approach. They thinned their charges, using less powder per round to stretch their supply. It wasn't about accuracy or power. It was about making 10 shots last until they could get 20. The practice required judgment. A full powder charge delivered maximum velocity and energy, but reducing it by a third or even half could still propel a bullet with enough force for small game, self-defense at close range, or practice shots. Hunters used reduced charges when stalking animals that didn't require heavy stopping power, rabbits, turkeys, or deer at shorter distances. The risk was unpredictability. Too little powder could leave a bullet lodged partway down the barrel, a squib load, which could cause a catastrophic failure if another round was fired behind it. Inconsistent charges also meant inconsistent accuracy. Even experienced shooters struggled to judge where a reduced load would hit compared to a full one. Some men marked their cartridges to track which were reduced and which were full power, using scratches, ink, or simply keeping them in separate pouches. Others eyeballed charges in the field, relying on experience and feel rather than measurement. Powder thinning was common among settlers and small-time hunters who couldn't afford to resupply regularly. It was less common among professional buffalo hunters or military units who needed reliable performance and could justify the expense of full charges. Thinning charges stretched supplies, but it also introduced variables that could turn a clean shot into a wounded animal or a jammed gun. It was a gamble, one that paid off only when the alternative was no shot at all. The next hack took that gamble further, addressing guns so worn or damaged that standard loads were dangerous to fire. Number 5. Reduced loads for worn or dangerous guns. Not every firearm on the frontier was safe to shoot. Barrels cracked from overuse, chambers stretched from repeated firing, and metal fatigued after years of hard service. But replacing a gun was expensive, and for many men, the weapon they had was the only one they'd ever own. So instead of retiring it, they adapted their ammunition. Reduced loads weren't just about saving powder, they were about keeping a weakened gun from exploding. Shooters identified firearms with visible wear, bulged barrels, hairline cracks, loose cylinders, and deliberately loaded them with lighter charges to reduce internal pressure. A revolver that might split under a full .44 charge could survive another season firing half-strength rounds. The practice was widespread among civilians who couldn't afford replacements, and soldiers issued aging surplus weapons. Frontier gunsmiths sometimes advised clients on safe loads for compromised guns, offering guidelines on powder weights that wouldn't push damaged metal past its limits. The trade-off was performance. Reduced loads meant lower velocity, less stopping power, and unpredictable accuracy. A worn revolver firing light charges might not penetrate heavy clothing or drop a target reliably. At longer ranges, bullets lost energy quickly, making even clean hits ineffective. But for men who needed a functional weapon and couldn't risk a catastrophic failure, reduced loads kept dangerous guns in service. It was a calculated risk, accepting diminished performance to avoid injury or the total loss of a firearm. Some shooters pushed this further, combining reduced loads with other workarounds: oversized bullets to grip worn rifling, extra wadding to seal loose chambers, or switching to smaller calibers that fit damaged bores. These improvised combinations kept guns running when by all rights they should have been scrapped. Reduced loads for worn guns weren't about making the best of good equipment. They were about making the worst equipment last long enough to matter. But worn guns still needed bullets that fit. The next hack addressed what happened when factory ammunition didn't match the gun at all. Number 4. Bullet resizing and hand swagging. Not every bullet fit every gun. Calibers varied slightly between manufacturers, and even within the same model, barrel tolerances could differ. A bullet cast for one rifle might be too large or too small for another. Factory ammunition sometimes arrived mismatched, or shooters inherited guns in obscure calibers with no ready supply of compatible rounds. The solution was resizing, forcing bullets through dies, or hand-swagging them into the correct dimensions. A simple resizing die was a hardened steel plate with a hole drilled to the desired diameter. A bullet was placed over the hole and driven through with a mallet, compressing it to the right size. More sophisticated setups used lever-driven presses, but on the frontier, most resizing was done by hand. Hand-swagging took the process further. Instead of just shrinking bullets, shooters hammered them into specific shapes, adjusting the nose profile, base design, or overall length to match their gun's chamber and throat. A skilled hand could take a generic round ball and transform it into a projectile tailored to a specific rifle. Professional hunters and competitive shooters practiced resizing regularly, ensuring tight fits that maximized accuracy and reduced gas leakage. Soldiers issued mismatched ammunition had no choice but to resize or risk jammed chambers and dangerous misfires. The process was labor-intensive and required decent tools. Poor resizing could deform bullets, create weak points, or introduce imbalances that destroyed accuracy. Overswagging hardened the lead unevenly, making it brittle and prone to fragmentation. But when factory ammunition didn't match and no replacements were available, resizing kept guns functional. It turned incompatible supplies into usable rounds and extended the life of stockpiled lead that would otherwise sit unused. Resizing addressed fit. The next hack addressed lethality by loading multiple projectiles into a single cartridge for devastating close-range effect. Number 3. Duplex, multi-projectile loads. Single bullets worked at range. At close quarters, some shooters wanted more. Duplex loads, 2 or more bullets stacked in a single cartridge, turned one shot into a spread of projectiles, increasing the chance of a hit when speed and chaos made precision impossible. The concept was simple. Instead of loading one bullet, a shooter loaded 2 or 3 smaller ones stacked nose to base inside the case. When fired, all projectiles left the barrel in sequence, spreading slightly as they traveled. At close range, inside 20 feet, the spread was minimal, but the cumulative damage was severe. Duplex loads saw use in self-defense situations, ambush scenarios, and close-quarters combat, where a single hit might not stop a threat. Lawmen, guards, and settlers defending cabins sometimes loaded them deliberately, knowing that multiple wounds inflicted simultaneously were far more effective than a single hole. The danger was extreme. Stacking bullets increased pressure unpredictably, especially in cartridges not designed for it. Weaker brass casings could split, and guns with marginal chambers risked catastrophic failure. Accuracy beyond close range was non-existent. Bullets tumbled, spiraled, or keyholed wildly. Some shooters combined duplex loads with reduced powder charges to manage pressure, but that introduced its own risks: squib loads, inconsistent ignition, or bullets lodging in the barrel. The practice required experience and a willingness to accept serious consequences if something went wrong. Duplex loads weren't standard. They were tactical gambles, used when stopping power mattered more than accuracy or safety. For men facing immediate, close-range threats, that calculation made sense. For everyone else, it was recklessness. But even duplex loads relied on functional brass casings. The next hack addressed what happened when brass itself became scarce, and shooters reloaded until failure. Number 2. Reloading until the brass failed. Metallic cartridges were expensive, and on the frontier, they were often the most costly component of ammunition. Once fired, the brass casing was too valuable to discard, so shooters reloaded them over and over until the metal physically gave out. Reloading followed a simple cycle. Remove the spent primer, resize the case to restore its original dimensions, insert a new primer, add powder, seat a bullet, and crimp. A single brass casing could be reloaded dozens of times if handled carefully, turning one purchase into weeks or months of ammunition. But brass fatigued with use. Each firing cycle stretched the metal slightly, especially near the case head and neck. Resizing compressed it back, but the stress accumulated. After enough cycles, casings developed hairline cracks, split necks, or separation at the base, a failure that could jam a gun or vent gas into the action. Experienced reloaders inspected brass carefully, running fingers along the case to feel for imperfections and discarding any with visible damage. Some marked casings to track reloads, retiring them after a set number of cycles. Others pushed further, reloading until the brass physically split during firing. The practice was universal among serious shooters. Buffalo hunters, competitive marksmen, and soldiers in the field all reloaded to stretch supplies. Frontier towns had shops that sold primers, powder, and bullets separately, catering to reloaders who couldn't afford factory-loaded rounds. Reloading didn't just save money, it made sustained shooting possible. Men who owned only 50 casings could fire hundreds of rounds over a season by reloading them repeatedly. It turned ammunition into a renewable resource, limited only by the availability of components and the lifespan of the brass. But reloading was still reactive, a response to scarcity rather than a solution to it. The final hack reframes everything above it by treating ammunition as a system rather than a consumable. Number 1. Ammunition as a closed-loop system. The ultimate ammunition hack wasn't a trick or modification. It was a mindset, treating every component as part of a renewable system rather than a disposable resource. Frontiersmen who survived long-term scarcity didn't just reload or improvise. They built complete ammunition workflows that cycled materials continuously. Lead was salvaged, melted, and recast. Brass was inspected, resized, and reused until structurally compromised, then melted down for repairs or trades. Primers were bought in bulk and stored carefully. Powder was rationed and measured precisely to avoid waste. Even failed rounds were broken down and their components redistributed. This wasn't a single technique. It was systematic resource management applied to every stage of ammunition use. A hunter on a months-long expedition would carry molds, sizing dies, a small scale, spare primers, and tools for case inspection. He'd salvage lead from game, track which brass casings were on which reload cycle, and adjust powder charges to extend his supply without sacrificing essential performance. The system required planning, discipline, and a deep understanding of how ammunition worked mechanically. Men who practiced it could operate for extended periods with minimal resupply, stretching initial stocks far beyond their intended lifespan. They didn't just react to shortages, they anticipated them and built redundancy into their loadouts. Military units on extended patrols adopted similar approaches, assigning soldiers to collect spent brass and maintain communal supplies. Professional hunters did the same, pooling resources and standardizing calibers to maximize component compatibility. The closed-loop system wasn't about making ammunition last forever. It was about making it last long enough. And in a world where the nearest supplier might be a month's ride away, that difference defined who finished their work and who didn't. Every hack above this one, reduced loads, resizing, duplex rounds, reloading, was a piece of that system. None worked in isolation. Together, they formed a comprehensive strategy for sustaining firepower when external supply chains failed. 15 hacks, none invented by engineers or advertised in catalogs. Each was a response to scarcity, distance, and the simple fact that the frontier didn't resupply on demand. Ammunition didn't just run out. It wore down, fouled up, and failed before the work was done. The men who survived weren't the ones who shot the most. They were the ones who made every component last, recycled what broke, and turned improvisation into routine. If you're here for how things actually worked, the systems, trade-offs, and uncomfortable realities, subscribe. This channel isn't about legends, it's about what survived. Hollywood fills gun belts with endless rounds. History fills them with brass reloaded a dozen times, bullets recast from salvaged lead, and powder charges measured by men who knew exactly how many shots they had left before they'd have to start walking. The real West wasn't armed by factories. It was armed by the shooters themselves. Piece by piece, reload by reload, until the brass split or the trail finally ended. Which of these hacks surprised you most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want the rest of the frontier's forgotten systems, the tools, tricks, and strategies that kept men alive when nothing else would, hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning.